So I'm going to do a couple of things that a lot of people don't know.
For sure.
I'm going to go into your It's good, it's good, it's good. It's good. The connection. And it flipped.
Yeah.
That was crazy. But it's good, but it was crazy.
Hello, everyone. How are y'all doing today? Good? All right. Well, hello and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name's Sydney. I'm a bookseller here, where we now host in-person and virtual events, along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything, please go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, a few housekeeping items. I'd like you to please silence your cell phone so as not to disrupt the event. We've lifted the mask mandate in the store, but if you like one, we have extra masks available at the front doors. When we get time to opening the floor for your questions, we've placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right. So please line up at one of these mics so that everyone can hear your question as in our recording of the event. We're live streaming today's program so that anyone can find it at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing up here at this table, so if you've not already purchased the book, we have plenty of copies available for purchase behind the registers up at the front of the store. We'll ask you to line up starting at this pillar also. We'll come by, ask your name for personalization, so please have your books ready for us. And then once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy just to help us out a little bit. And now that all that's out of the way, I'm really excited to welcome Ben Jealous, celebrating the release of Never Forget Our People Were Always Free, a parable of American healing. Ben Jealous has spent his professional life at the nexus of social change, media, and emerging technologies. He's a former Democratic nominee for governor of the great state of Maryland, former national president and CEO of the NAACP, former executive director of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, and for more than half a decade has been investing in social impact startups. While at the NAACP, Jealous led a series of wholesale changes in how the organization used social media and related technologies to enhance its organizing. He is also a professor of practice at the University of Pennsylvania. Jealous will be in conversation with April Ryan. Ryan is a White House correspondent, the longest-serving Black female journalist, where she's been covering urban issues from the White House for 26 years. She's been featured in Essence, Vogue, Cosmopolitan, Elle magazine, and other top publications. She served on the board of the prestigious White House Correspondents Association and is an esteemed member of the National Press Club. April is the author of the award-winning book, The Presidency in Black and White, also At Mama's Knee, Mothers and Race in Black and White, and most recently, Black Women Will Save the World, an Anthem. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose Ben Jealous and April Ryan.
Thank you.
Ben, it's always good to be here at Politics and Prose, the premier bookstore in the nation. Yeah, you can't get better than that. I want to thank Brad and Lissa for having us to talk, particularly in this moment.
Amen.
This moment, for a time such as this. Never forget our people were always free. This is the part I like. A parable of American healing. A parable of American healing. What does that healing look like?
You know, the need for it is urgent. I live in Pasadena, Maryland. It's a town that the Washington Post has labeled the most racist town in our state. With that said, Kathy Hughes and I both live there, and we both love it. So, you know.
And the Braxton family is from there too, right?
Yes,
yeah,
amen.
The singing family, yeah.
And you know, life is always more complex than the Washington Post likes to make it. I'll just put it that way. But during COVID, you know, I really got to spend a lot of time with my neighbors, walking our dogs and such. And there was a lot of casual talk about Civil War. And I decided that it was time for me to write a book that gave people hope and a sense of direction about how we actually pulled this country back together. I know what that looks like. I know what it takes because that's been the journey of my own family. My father was disinherited by most of his family, disowned and disinherited for marrying my mom. My parents had to leave Maryland because their marriage was against the law. And I grew up kind of on a bridge between the North and the South, black and white. Even the old world, the East Coast, and the kind of the cutting edge of California. And my parents, I've watched them kind of heal themselves, heal their own families. And I decided that it was time to actually put a book in people's hands that not just gave them hope, but gave them a sense about how to start taking the steps that actually allow us to pull this country back together.
Pulling the country back together after hundreds of years of trying to figure out just who we are, where we come from, as people are banning books, banning stories about true stories about our history, etc. But in the midst of this, as you were talking about just the genesis of you, I thought about Trevor Noah. Yeah, born a crime, you know? Talk to me about the parallels, because what people don't understand, we are just almost 50 years out of getting all of those rights, where black and white people could marry, where we had voting rights, where we received the Civil Rights Act that allowed us to go to restaurants on the side of the road, stay in hotels on the side of the road. And I think about, within Black History Month, I think about these laws that we had. All of them are not here now and are challenged, like voting rights and affirmative action is being challenged in the United States Supreme Court in this moment. But I think about what life was like before these laws were passed. I think about people like Charles Drew, Dr. Charles Drew, the black man who changed the dynamic of what we call the current blood donation system in this nation. He died because he was driving in North Carolina before the Civil Rights Act, and he fell asleep at the wheel. He couldn't go to a hotel on the side of the road. He died in a hospital because his injuries were so grave. Now, this is the man that created the modern blood donation system in this nation. His daughter was a city councilwoman, Charlene Drew Jarvis, here in the city. And when he went into the hospital, they took him downstairs in the black part of the hospital. A white doctor recognized him and took him upstairs, but it was too late. And you talk about a parable of healing.
Yes.
And that wasn't long ago. So in this moment, as we watch Sarah Huckabee Sanders in her response, I mean, it was more than harsh for some. For others, that's what they want in this nation. She's the governor of the state of Arkansas. She spoke of banning Latinx, CRT, but yet she's talking about freedoms and talking about the Little Rock Nine. Who are we as a nation? Who are we?
Well, you know, you're talking about Trevor Noah and South Africa. And apartheid and segregation, obviously, are kind of mirror images.
Yes.
And the ANC was actually modeled on the structure of the NAACP when it was founded. But it evolved very differently. The way if you take the same plant and you plant it in different soil, it can grow very differently. For me, though, it was important to get back beyond the start of segregation, to understand like what we had emerged out of. Because segregation was so unnaturally sterile. Like my mom was 14 when she made her first white friend. That's insane in a country that has as many white people as this one. You can live in a space so black. Yeah. And my father, similarly, you know, the presumption was that up in Maine, he wouldn't have had any black friends, and most of his friends didn't. But his father, you know, had crossed that racial barrier as a doctor. He was the only white doctor who would do house visits into black communities up there. And so my dad actually grew up with a bunch of black friends. But for my mom, it was very, you know, when she found herself dating my dad, it was like, you know, he proposed to her at the end of the first week.
Wow.
And she was like, hold up. Like, I didn't plan on like going on a date with a white guy, let alone marrying one. And he would ask 2 more times in 2 weeks, and she would say yes, and they've been together for 66 years.
66 years.
Yeah, she broke up with the black race car driver after she said yes. No, it was okay. A whirlwind. Yeah, right. It was a whirlwind. Right. Yeah, it was a whirlwind romance. She has no regrets. But when I got back beyond it, into the time of slavery, into the period between the end of Reconstruction and the start of Jim Crow, what I realized was the lesson that Dr. King was trying to teach us at the end of his life, that racism, yes, is everything we experience as black people or people of color, and yet it is also a wedge that is driven to divide people and keep them from uniting. That's what he was trying to teach us in the Poor People's Campaign. That was the point he was assassinated. And then I thought for a second and I said, Dr. King wasn't assassinated in a desegregation effort. He was assassinated trying to unite the poor, black and white. Of all the Black Panther leaders who were assassinated, Fred Hampton was the one where the police planned the execution. It was like the most aggressive, the most horrendous of all of them. What was he trying to do? Unite the young patriots, poor whites, and the Black Panthers. Before Medgar Evers, there was Harry Moore and Harriet Moore, 1951. And we choose to remember Harry Moore as maybe his most famous house, president of Florida NAACP, blown up by the Ku Klux Klan along with his wife, Christmas night, 1951. One of their daughters lived in College Park when I was president of the NAACP. I met her. She was in the 80s. She was still a shell of a, really just tremendously transformed by the fact that her parents had gone to bed on Christmas night and then they couldn't even find a tooth. There was that much dynamite. But what we forget about Harry Moore is he was also the president of the Florida Progressive Party. He had registered 1 million voters the year before. He was trying to unite poor folks, black and white. And when I got back into the period before Jim Crow, my mind started exploding, April. Like every 2 days I was doing research.
And this goes way back. You get into the Confederacy. This book goes way back. But keep going. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
because
no.
I'm into history like this.
Well, look. First, like the first thing that just unsettled me was I figured out that Robert E. Lee was my cousin.
And who else? Who else is your cousin?
Dick
Cheney. Along with you and Barack Obama
Yes,
share that.
and
Dick Cheney.
Thurgood Marshall. And Thomas Jefferson, and apparently James
Sally
Taylor.
Hemings.
Sally Hemings, yeah, apparently her kids because we're cousins to Thomas Jefferson, right? I used to joke that my family was black, like in the Jeffersonian model of blackness, until I figured out he was our cousin. I was like, oh, this isn't a joke anymore. This is just what it was, right? And so there was a couple of moments that really kind of blew my mind. The first was I had the will of the last man to own my grandmother's paternal side of her family, like her grandfather, her great-grandfather. And there were no other enslaved people mentioned in the will except for my grandmother's great-grandfather. And while it didn't free him, every line in that paragraph was about protecting him. And I said to Henry Louis Gates Jr., I said, Skip, help me out here. What am I looking at? And he said, well, based on the DNA, based on this and some other records, best we can tell, the owner understands that his enslaved manservant is his 6-year older brother. They would have been raised in the plantation household together. And while he doesn't have the courage to free him, he's trying to make sure that he's not tortured in his old age, that he's not mistreated when the owner dies, because the owner knows that he's dying and his older brother will live longer than him. Well, that just opened up this whole world, right? Because again, I had viewed all of history against the backdrop of segregation that my mom had been raised in. And the walls seemed like they were, fierce and thick, and there was no, and all of a sudden it's like, wait a second. The slave owner understands that his slave is his brother, he's trying to protect him. Well, my grandmother's grandfather would have been the owner's nephew. And he walked out of slavery at the last day of slavery in Virginia, the Battle of Appomattox. He walks out. And he's 17 years old, and by the time he's doubled that age, he's leading the black Republicans in Virginia. And I'm like, where do you get that hubris? You're born a slave, and then you become this statewide political leader. And
black people were Republicans.
Yes, well,
en masse.
And that was the Progressive Party at the time. And I said, well, part of the equation, there's all sorts of reasons, but one of the factors must be that he understood that that he shared blood with the men who had led the Commonwealth. That had to be part of it. You know, in other words, the knowledge that your owner is your uncle, that he's a proud and outspoken cousin to Robert E. Lee, has to be part of your factor in understanding who you are, because Edward David Bland, my grandmother's grandfather, would run against his white cousin and beat him in an election after the end of Reconstruction. And that was the next thing that kind of blew my mind, was we were always taught basically like, you know, there was a Civil War, there was Reconstruction, and then there was like Jim Crow. But nothing happens in an instant. There was a period of transition in between. And when I realized that my grandmother's grandfather had run for office in 1880, and Reconstruction had ended in 1876, and the terror of the Klan had been unleashed for 4 years, and when he would run for re-election, 6 people would be killed in that election by white supremacists. I realized I'd stumbled into this kind of, like I'd been taught a fiction. I'd been told he was a Reconstruction statesman. He wasn't. He was a statesman after Reconstruction. And then the only thing I'd been taught about him is that he helped start Virginia State University. And so as I dug, what I realized was, A, it was after Reconstruction. B, he led blacks out of the Republican Party. C, he went into partnership with a former Confederate general, it just kept getting weirder, to create a third party called the readjusters. And they took over the Virginia government for about 4 or 5 years. The governorship, both houses, both U.S. senators. And so then I was like, well, who is this general and who are the readjusters? Well, the readjusters were a response to the plantation elite trying to reassert their control over the state now that the former Confederates had been reenfranchised. And the plantation elite went a bridge too far. They said, you know, this Civil War debt is onerous. We're going to have to shut down the public schools to pay for it. Without thinking for a second that the former Confederate soldiers, the men who didn't own slaves but fought to defend slavery, had been relying on those free public schools for more than a decade for their kids. So back then, women couldn't vote. These men bolt the Democratic Party to set up their own party, and their name readjuster comes from their demand. Readjust the terms of the Civil War debt so we can keep our public schools. Well, it was the black Reconstruction statesmen that started those schools. And so as the leader of that group of people, my grandmother's grandfather, Edward David Bland, approaches General William B. Mahone and says, let's strike a deal. We want to keep those schools. I'll lead blacks into your party, and then you'll have enough power. When the dust settled, they had a party that was about 40% white, about 60% black, a majority black party whose principal leader was a former Confederate general, whose deputy was a freedman. And they take over the state government. Now, stop me if anybody ever taught you there was a period in American history when Johnny Reb and the freedmen got together and took over state governments. And then you got to ask yourself, why didn't they teach us this?
This is what they're trying to keep us from knowing now.
Right, and it's because the walls of Jim Crow came up right after that epoch.
Yeah.
And what would be more threatening to Jim Crow than the notion that populist needs, the need to educate children and feed families, was enough for people to get over the hurts of the Civil War?
No, but what would be more threatening to Jim Crow and future generations was to ratify and make law the promise of Sherman.
Yes.
To bridge wealth, the wealth gap, to have homes, have ownership, to be free in every sense of the word. And when we talk about that promise of Sherman, what was it? It wasn't a mule, but what was it?
It was 40 acres.
40 acres.
Yeah.
40 acres, yeah.
Well, and this is the thing, right? Like, what do those readjusters do in like that 4 or 5 years they controlled the government? Just in 4 or 5 years, they saved the free public schools. They radically expanded Virginia Tech, making it what it is today, the working person's rival to UVA. They created Virginia State, the first public HBCU south of the Mason-Dixon, and gave it the mission to train black teachers, and they quadrupled the number of black teachers while they were in office. They abolished the public whipping post. They raised taxes on corporations and led the state from a budget deficit into a budget surplus. and they abolished the poll tax. And it was that last one that kind of blew my mind again, because the poll tax was woven into the Virginia Constitution in 1902. You and I were taught, the poll tax was an assault on black political power, like that demonstrated during Reconstruction, to make sure that would never come back. And it certainly was. It suppressed 80% of the black votes.
Yeah.
But you know who else it suppressed? 50% of the white vote. And who specifically? The poorer whites who couldn't afford the equivalent of $50 today to cast a ballot. And who were they? The ones who were most likely to have joined the readjusters and helped the blacks take over the state government. And how long had they had the right to vote? Only since the 1840s. So white men who owned no land were enfranchised in the 1840s. Black men were enfranchised in the 1860s. And by the time you get to 1880, they're teaming up and taking over state governments. And by the time you get to 1902, they pass a poll tax to make sure that essentially all of that power is wiped out, essentially outlawing a populist multiracial movement.
Post-Reconstruction, we saw black men who were in Congress, right?
Yes.
So it is real. But with all of this, it was just last year, 2022, you were outside of the White House fighting for voting rights.
Yes.
Bringing church choirs and Martin Luther King III.
Yeah.
And listen,
We had fun.
You had fun. I had to cover it. But and they were going to jail. They loved going to jail. I'm like,
yeah, I went 5 times, and I'm like, officially, I think I'm off the White House Christmas list for life.
I think
at this point.
You didn't go this year, right?
I wasn't invited.
That's right. That's why. So anyway, but seriously, with that said, and to look at what happened before, did you have to wrestle with some of this? Because it seems like it's great history, but sometimes your family may have been on the wrong side with the Confederacy.
Yeah, well, they were like on every side. You know what I'm saying? Yes, what it pushed me to really understand, and I'm just seeing your Delta bag. My grandma died at 105 last summer. She was Virginia State in 1936.
And I'm a Delta too, honorary, yes. Ooh.
But yeah, I'll ask that question again. I got distracted thinking about grandma.
I know, yeah.
It's hard. I'm still mourning. She was with us till 105. It hasn't been a year yet. But
wow.
Yeah.
That's longevity.
Oh, you were talking about the family.
Yeah. And dealing with, wrestling with some of the things that are juxtaposed to who you are today.
No, that's right. It was helpful that Barack Obama's also Dick Cheney's cousin, because at least I had context for like digesting that one. But when I got to Robert E. Lee, I was just flummoxed. I was just like, oh my God. But then what it helped me understand is this, that we talk about the American family, and yet for a lot of us, black folks, you're like, well, like, are we part of that, And then you realize, you know what? Like, our American family is dysfunctional, it's abusive, and yet, at the end of the day, it actually is a family. I was there when Myrlie Evers approached John McCain backstage in 2008 and said, John, my people are from West Point, Mississippi, too. Yeah, we come off the McCain plantation. Yeah, John, I'm pretty sure we're related. Well,
what did he do?
I mean, who doesn't want to be related to Myrlie Evers, right? Like, she's the closest thing we got to, like, Coretta Scott King left, Yeah. He was running for president. He was blotto. He was just like, God bless him. Strom Thurmond's maternal uncle's name is Al Sharpton. They're from the same little corner of South Carolina where all the Al Sharptons descend from the same Al Sharpton. When I say, like, we are a family in ways that are profound. When I went into my parents' DNA, not surprising, in the Nile River Valley 50,000 years ago, their tribes are pretty close to each other, right? One goes up the Nile River, one comes into West Africa. Fine, expected that. What I didn't expect is that they're actually cousins through English and French royalty because of the slave owners that my mom descends from, right, who raped people on the plantation, and my dad's family. So we're taught like black and white are so separate, they're so distinct. There's never the twain shall meet. It's and my parents' marriage was treated as such an odd thing. When I was researching the readjusters, the guy who they beat was running on an anti-miscegenation ticket. That means there were enough interracial couples in Virginia in like 1879 that a guy decided to center his whole gubernatorial campaign around it, and the dude lost. And the dude lost. So it was actually quite healing in the midst of COVID, as I composed this book as 23 speeches to my computer, to be processing all this ancient history and actually find reasons why I could be hopeful that we could come together now. Because if Confederates and freedmen got together, let alone create a party that was pro-workers' rights, pro-civil rights, pro-voting rights, and then why can't we get together now?
You know that answer. You know that answer, and I wanna ask you for that answer in a minute. But I want to say this first. A wise man this week, someone at the highest heights, said something in an off the record. They said, every 2 to 5 generations we go backwards. We go back to that cycle. We go through a cycle every 2 to 5 generations, and it looks like we're back in that cycle of the 1960s, 1950s,
1920s, yeah.
Well, yeah, I get you. But
Red Summer, Tulsa, the 1920s.
That's true. When Tulsa, the 40 is at least 40 blocks of black wealth is now half a block sandwiched under an overpass, pushed in by a minor league baseball league, and a university research center is cramming it in. Okay? Let's talk about the 60s, though. 1966, the Black Panther Party came to be because of police brutality. And they came up with their 10-point plan. And we are now, as a nation, funding school lunch programs and school breakfast programs, right? We're funding free clinics. But it took that push that was primarily, I know the picture of the Black Panther Party was black men wearing leather and berets, but 70% of that push was black women.
Oh, of course, it always is. 70 would be low. NAACP is like 85.
Right. But Frederica Newton, the widow of Huey P. Newton, told me that 70. Yeah. So, and let's speak of the NAACP, since you just brought up the NAACP. In the book, you said the NAACP is not black; it's very black. What's very black? As the former head of the
it's like the Sierra Club. I actually used to find. So I'm the incoming executive director of the Sierra Club. And what I used to say precisely was, the NAACP is not black, is very black. Like the Sierra Club is not white, it's very white. What's the difference, right? And here's the irony. Now I'm leading the one that's very white. Black means it's just black, right? White means it's just white, like a drinking fountain, like a bathroom. Very just means like it's mostly.
It's entrenched in the culture and the history and the strength.
Well, yeah, but I guess I'm saying is like if a white person walks into the NAACP, there's a place for them.
Yeah.
Right.
And
they might have to get used to being like in a very black room, but it's not an exclusively black room. That was the point. And but going back for a second, you were talking about the Black Panthers. We're talking about police brutality, and like one of the things that's hardest for us to do when the pain is so searing, when our kids are killed by the police again and again and again, is to actually get on the balcony and say, what is happening here in this whole room? And to see that there's other corners of the room. I remember, I had come right out of the NAACP. My last campaign was trying to get George Zimmerman in prison. I'd gotten death threats.
And Trayvon would have been 28 years old. 28 years old this weekend. Yes, go ahead.
And we had gotten the most serious death threats I've ever received. The police surrounded my house on a swatting thing from a white supremacist juvenile in Northern Europe, and it was a mess. The police in Montgomery County threatened to kill my wife right in front of my daughter. Yeah, real talk, because they got this swatting call. But it was all, we had 22 police officers with AR-15s, aimed up at my wife while I was coming home from the NAACP convention. So it was against that backdrop that I end up essentially a couple of years later helping Bernie Sanders become president. And we go to Detroit and we go to Chicago, and then I'm told that we're going to Missouri, and we're all excited because we think Missouri, we could win. We had just won Michigan, and we would win Missouri too. But they say Missouri, not Missouri. Now Missouri will get you to Kansas City or St. Louis. Missouri is the Ozarks, and that's where the plane touches down. And we're at this rally in the Ozarks, and they tell me that I'm bringing out Bernie, and I'm like, are you sure? Because like, have you seen that crowd? Like half the men are in deer hunting camouflage, and there's like five black people in the room, and like 5,000 white people in that room. You sure they want to hear if the former head of the NAACP? Like, yeah, Ben, go out there and give your speech. They'll love it. I went out there, I gave my speech. It was about the danger of Donald Trump. This is back when people would laugh, when like 2 months before George Stephanopoulos cracked up at Keith Ellison saying that Donald Trump might win the primary. You remember that moment. This is 2 months before that.
I was always saying it.
Yeah, I mean, because we have sense. And so did these folks. And they loved their neighbors, or they were a little afraid of their neighbors. And they saw the way that Trump's movement was sweeping through the area. And they responded great to my speech, but I got afraid when Bernie spoke, because there was a part of his speech when he called on the police to stop killing unarmed black women and unarmed black men. And if this crowd was at all tepid in their response, it was going to throw me off, because I had been dealing with all of this. We just come from dealing with, was it Laquan McDonald, I think, you know? And the way that was covered up. And Bernie puts out the call, and I get real quiet, and the crowd erupts. Half the guys in deer hunting camouflage jump up in their chairs with their fists in the air, making some holler I imagine they only make in the Ozarks. And then it hit me. You know, when I was a kid, spending my summers in West Baltimore, my cousin's favorite show was The Dukes of Hazzard. Because ain't nobody gonna...
Friday Night with Daisy Duke. Yeah.
No, it was Boss Hogg. Because the way that Boss Hogg treated them was the same way that the cops treated us. And then I remembered all the stats from fighting police brutality. The thing we haven't ever wrapped our mind around in this country is that it's the class of people who end up in prison who get beat up by the cops. You walk in a prison, you see it real clearly. Roughly half the men in prison, well, put this way, roughly 40% are white, roughly 40% are black, 20% are kind of everybody else. But what they all have in common is they were too poor, like 95+%, too poor to afford their own lawyer. And if you look at the stats of unarmed people being killed by the police, there's a surprisingly high number of white folks. But again, they tend to be poor whites. And you say, well, how could it be that that could be happening and we don't see it in the media? Well, there are almost twice as many whites in poverty as blacks. There's 16 million and change whites in poverty. There's 8 million and change black folks in poverty. But whose image do you see in the paper?
Black folks.
Black folks, black folks, black folks, black folks.
But if you go to what? Appalachia.
Yeah, you go to South Baltimore. You go to Dundalk.
Yeah.
I mean, you go like 6 miles from your house.
Yeah.
You know? And then you sit at the bar and you ask people, like, what are the cops like, you know, out here in Dundalk? And you hear about a lot of abuse. And so it's important, I think, to understand that, because that's the only way anything gets better. And I talk about this in the book. You know, in Baltimore for decades, we've talked about the heroin problem. And it was treated like it was a criminal scourge. And the stereotype was that it was black folks. Now, I used to work in the financial district in Baltimore, where one morning I looked to my right, I looked to my left, there was a black homeless guy I had to step over who was nodding off from heroin. I looked to my right, there was a white an investor. There was an investor and those guys use it as a performance-enhancing drug when they use it. And he was nodding off on a bench outside his office, dressed to the nines.
Wow.
And then something funny happened. In the Midwest and in the Mid-South, the heroin importation route suddenly changed. They had been across the Caribbean. They had been into ports for decades. NAFTA was passed. They came right into the middle of the country, right up the middle of the country in trucks. Black tar heroin was showing up in places it had never shown up before. And a lot of folks started dying, and a lot of sheriffs and deputies were burying people that they went to high school with.
From the North American Free Trade Agreement?
Yes. North American Free Trade Agreement opens up trucking lanes, and there's, notice that like Miami Vice is now a nostalgia thing? Yeah. Because drugs actually get transported right up
95.
Right up, yes, yeah, or whatever, 55, right? Right in the middle of the country. And so they started to publish the photos of the corpses. and the corpses looked like whatever town, because drug abuse is pretty constant across racial groups. So the new thing in the paper were photos of all these dead white kids from opiates, from heroin, from pills. And what happened? The public policy conversation shifted suddenly in America to opiate addiction is a health crisis that we need rehabilitation to address. How many black folks got locked up in Baltimore, with them acting like it was a crime when it was always an addiction? And so that's the power. One of the ways that we heal is we got to insist that the media show the full face of the problem.
Yeah. Middle America was very upset. That was one of the most pressing issues in the campaigning during Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump's fight for the White House.
Yes.
That was one of the biggest issues. But I'm going to go to questions, and if you have a question, please go to the mic. I want a question, not a comment, please. But never forget, our people were always free. Reading this book and understanding your history, who you are, you're an activist through and through, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a father, whether you are in finance, whether you're running for governor.
Yeah.
And it is so interesting, that story right there. He ran for governor, a serious attempt. And one of the strongest people that was behind him in his run for governor happened to be a man called Wes Moore, who's now governor of Maryland. How about, isn't that crazy?
Well, I mean, let me tell you how that happened. And let me just, Jack, can you say hi to everybody? Can you just smile? This is my son, Jack.
Yeah.
He sat in a few of these, and he found 3 great books downstairs. So he's enjoying those. Wes, in Baltimore, we're proud to have 5 black men who have been Rhodes Scholars. In that birth order, I'm 3rd, Wes is 4th.
Kurt Schmoke is one of them.
Absolutely. And frankly, Kurt was inspired by Paul Sarbanes, because the pecking order of Baltimore, if a Greek guy can break through, maybe a black guy can break through next. And so Wes calls me 2 years ago, and he says, you're first in the polls this morning. Are you going to run? And I said, well, I just told my daughter that I'm only going to run if you don't run. He said, well, I just told my wife the same thing. So who's running? I said, you are, because wife tripes daughter. I was like, brother, I'm a single dad. I got a daughter in high school. Your kids will be just fine. My kids need me at home right now. You run. And then Anthony Brown and I did something I don't think any 2 black men have ever done before. We had both won the Democratic primary. And we called Wes over to my house. We agreed to back him, of course. And then we sat down and we explained to him exactly how you win that primary. Because he was about to start in 4th, just like I started in 4th. And we walked through every step, and we lined up some meetings for him. But I don't think you've ever had 3 black men win a Democratic primary for governor in a row, and then 2 of them sit down with the 3rd one and say, okay, this is how you win.
And he was at 1% at one point.
Yes.
And look at where he is now.
Yeah.
He's one of the shining. And you talk about the parable of American healing. He is one of those shining spots that people are hoping that will be part of the healing.
Yeah, I have great hope for Wes.
Yeah,
I have great hope
of
for
this
Wes.
nation that's going through major growing pains.
Yes.
Major growing pains. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. This
Come
is
close to the mic. Okay.
This is.
It's on. It's on. You
Okay. If I can just start with a brief story.
Sure.
And then ask a question, because this is
We
really.
I know we got a short period of time. We can make a synopsis of a synopsis and then a question.
Real short. My family's very diverse. My husband's black. I worked for a number of years, over a decade, in Maine, rural Maine, working with schools. A lot of really poor white kids who were struggling in similar ways to poor black kids in various places, right? And that was my work. I went to a very fancy school, I'll name it Harvard, and was in some law classes, and in some law classes related to civil rights, I tried to make the point, like with at least 100 students, that while they didn't have the racial component, many kids in the schools that I worked with, the poor white kids, felt as disenfranchised, which is what I think you were saying.
Like there was no hope. Like they were trapped in
They were
in
trapped
poverty.
in their world, and we were trying to give them a way to see a broader future, and it was different because they could put on a suit and they could pass, but in their own mind, they felt like they were trapped. Yeah. And I was trying to make that point, at a very fancy school with a lot of really progressive people,
Yeah.
and I was eviscerated.
Yes.
I was eviscerated
Yes.
because one person actually said to me, well, they don't riot in rural America. And I said, they don't have enough people to riot. But that didn't mean that the people that were there were not suffering. So I guess my question and comment is that I feel like there's also a gap or a need for progressives to understand the struggle of white, rural, poor. And that's why when you started with this comment about Martin Luther King not being killed until he started to try to unite
Yeah.
people, and that's what I felt back in the 1980s when I went through all of this, that there was an attempt to try to unite
split those.
poor folks who were out of the mainstream, who were being punished. There's an extra layer with race and class,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
there is
No, there is some
also,
commonality
there's
there.
a commonality, and that the unity of that would have been a lot more powerful. So my question, I guess, is how do we help progressives, myself included, understand the need to think about poor white people as victims?
Bring everyone under the
You
umbrella.
can stop right there.
Bring
with
everyone
just
under the
think
umbrella.
about poor white people.
Thank you, ma'am.
Because that's where it starts.
Yeah.
There's as I discussed in the book, there's a researcher named John Powell at UC Berkeley who studies public support for everything public and the images of who's poor at the time. In the Great Depression, the images of the poor were almost exclusively white. They ignored black poverty. And public support for everything public was through the roof. The Civil Rights Movement and beyond, the images of poor have been almost exclusively black or black and brown, and public support, certainly amongst whites, has gone through the floor. And one of the most important things that newsrooms can do right now is to show the white poor. And there are almost twice as many as black folks, so you won't have a hard time finding them. But again, one of the through lines in this book was that there's been rebellion after rebellion after rebellion of poor whites and poor blacks, indentured servants and enslaved people. The American Revolution itself, the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre. There's two records created by bona fide founding fathers of this country of the Boston Massacre. One is Paul Revere's etching, which depicts everybody as white. The other is John Adams' defense of the Redcoats. He was the defense lawyer for the Redcoats who killed those young Americans. And how did he describe the crowd? Negroes, mulattoes, and jack tars. Jack tar is a term for the poorest white sailor, the guy who's tarring the deck. But the other two are descriptors for black folks. Now, first of all, that goes to what conversation earlier. He was trying to excuse police brutality by saying that the crowd had black folks in it. But the other thing is that's exactly what we were not taught about the American Revolution. We act like Boston is the whitest place in the world. It's a port town that's always been diverse. And we act like Crispus Attucks was the only one, like he was some anomaly. But there was enough there that John Adams used two different descriptors for black. There was a diversity of black people there. And so, 1660s, Gloucester and Bacon's Rebellion, 1776, 1880s, 1960s. It's a through line in our history. It's part of what gives me hope. The middle of the century will be hard. The middle of American centuries are basically all have been hard. But I'm hopeful that by the time we get to the end of this century, our children will be in a much better place. Because that magnetism between the poor, which is frankly just needing a better future for the family and for the kids, keeps pulling people together. And thank you for your frontline teaching in Maine. Poverty in Maine is crushing. You have people whose career is harvesting worms. It's a state where they only got rid of Potato Week like a decade ago because there were still people who, for a month to harvest potatoes for the winter. Because in the timberlands and stuff, people ask me to describe Maine because my dad's from there. I was like, it's basically Georgia without black people. But
And real quick, before we go to the next question, one thing that we forgot, and Ben, you know this, Coretta Scott King, the widow of Dr. Martin Luther King, when she was alive, said one of the reasons why they killed Dr. King is because this one black man was able to galvanize so many, the powerful, and his focus was going to shift from race to poverty with Bobby Kennedy. With Bobby Kennedy.
Yes.
And if both of them had lived, they would have dealt with the issue of poverty for white, black, for everyone. So it was money. It was money. It was about money. And what we see today play out, I believe, from this crazy perch that I sit in, I believe that there's so much upheaval, unrest, dis-ease, if you will, in the spirit, because you feel like you're not touched, as you said, by government. You're not seen. You're cast away. And there's got to be some kind of way, I don't know, maybe with the hope that you have, there needs to be an umbrella for all. Because some people feel left out. With each party or each person that comes in, there's always someone who feels left out. When do we make sure that we have everyone under that umbrella?
Well, there's a sermon that I refer to in the book, and then we'll get to the question. But I think it's very appropriate for the times that we're in. It was a sermon of a man who was a Methodist preacher, and became a Klansman, participated in a lynching, and lost his mind. And to regain his sanity, he decided he basically had to choose Jesus over the Klan. And he left the Klan and he moved his family in the early 1950s in Alabama, before Brown, like 52, into the civil rights movement. His son would go on to be one of the founders of SNCC. And the sermon that he gave was this. He'd say, any white man who has his hand on the neck of a Negro, keeping him down in the ditch, needs to recognize that he's down in the ditch with him. And then he would say, a rich man walks down the middle of the road and laughs at both men in the ditch, the black one and the white one. And again, we have to really discipline ourselves to ask, frankly, who's struggling with what I'm struggling with? Because in a democracy, that's how you make change happen. And when I was head of the NAACP, we were able to shrink the prison system in Georgia and in Texas by working with great organizers. In Georgia, it was Stacey Abrams from her post as minority leader. In Texas, there was a woman named Ana Yanes Correa, the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition. But ultimately, Stacey and I and Nathan Deal pulled together a coalition with the help of Newt Gingrich that was the NAACP plus the Tea Party, making an end run around moderates in the Democratic and Republican Party, and shrunk their prison system. And in Texas, we did the same thing because the moderates, both of them sets, were taking money from the private prison industry. But we were able to get the activists in both parties to create a majority. In Texas, we did that 52 times. Rick Perry only vetoed 2 bills. That's how Texas went from 150 years of only opening up new prisons and refurbishing old ones to shutting down 12. Yeah, that's amazing. That's what happens when we get together. We can actually make big things happen.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I don't know if my question is in there.
Ask it.
But I just wanted a quick remark. During COVID, when the federal government was issuing checks, there were some articles about whites' reactions to receiving those checks that were very positive. And there was no stigma to those checks. There weren't welfare. But it was just remarkable. I don't know if anybody's done some very sensitive research there, but I just wanted to feed that in. No, my question is about Sierra Club, and I don't know if you could talk about it because you really haven't begun.
Yeah, I start in 2 weeks.
But I was just wondering how it fits.
Oh, sure, that I can talk about.
Thank you.
No, thank you. I was with Lou Gossett Jr. at the Image Awards.
Which year?
Yeah, it was probably 2012, maybe 2013. I think it was probably my last year. And Lou said, Ben, I've been in this fight for racial justice my whole life. Sometimes I feel like, while we're fighting over who's in first class, somebody needs to look out the window and realize that the plane has lost like 25,000 feet of altitude in the last 3 minutes. He said, if we did that, then we would spend less time fighting over first class and more time running back and forth in the airplane trying to figure out who was the smartest person to get into the cockpit so we can regain altitude. Because who's ever flying this plane is either drunk, asleep, or dead, Ben. And I said to Lou, that's real beautiful, brother. What are you talking about? And he said, the planet, Ben, the planet's dying. It don't matter who's in first class on a dead planet. As you see when I was president of the NAACP, our young people were on fire to end climate change. They led me to making my first order of business when I started launching our climate justice program. Every time there was a disaster, it seemed like we would get called at a partnership with the Red Cross around resilience and around responding to these disasters. And then once there was a flood in the Iowa River, and I said, oh, I don't have to go this time. They said, no, Ben, there's a few black folks in Iowa, and the ones who are there live in the floodplains. Mm-hmm. And so we organized things for Iowa. The way that this fits to me is I've spent my life building big, uncomfortably large coalitions. I was blessed to be trained by at least four of Dr. King's proteges. And at least two of them said to me the same thing, that Dr. King would say to them, first, if you can't say it in 25 words or less, come back to me when you can, because nobody's going to remember what you just said. The second thing he would say was, if you're comfortable in your coalition is too small. And so this is the biggest challenge of my life. It's, I think, at the end of the day, it's the most existential crisis for the planet and for everybody on it. And for me, it's just an extension of a life spent building uncomfortably large coalitions. I just did Newt Gingrich's podcast for 45 minutes. It was actually kind of a warm reunion because he gave me a 2-page letter of endorsement for the entire NAACP criminal justice agenda without demanding one edit to our agenda. Grover Norquist would endorse half. He was like, I'm cool with shrinking these prisons, but the other half of our agenda was take the money you save from prisons and send it to the public universities. Newt Gingrich is one of the few conservative leaders who remembers that poor white people exist in a visceral way. And he understood the transformative importance of public universities for them too. I only got to agree with you on one thing in order to be your friend. In politics, I was taught that by General Powell, and it served me well. I'm content to fight with Newt 99% of that time, but the one time we actually figured out something we agreed on, we got a lot of good stuff done.
Yes, sir.
And I'm a Frederick County Democrat, so you had my support at 18.
Thank you. Yes. And we did good work out there. We flipped that county.
Absolutely, we did.
Yeah.
So you left us hanging. You mentioned Kurt, and then you, and then Wes as three Rhodes Scholars from Baltimore. Who are the others?
Oh, who are the others?
There you go. Thank you.
Yes. So Wes and I are 3 and 4. Kurt's 1. Brad Berry's a pastor's number 2, and Wes's chief of staff, who is actually an editor on my book, Fagin Harris, is number 5. Awesome. He's a good friend of April's too.
Thank you.
He's an amazing guy. He's his chief of staff. I saw him at the inauguration.
Yeah.
This has been such a wonderful time. Any more questions? I mean, come on up. We got time. But either way, as people are making their way, don't be shy because we're not shy.
No, we're not.
No, we're not. Not at all. And this is, come on up, come on to the mic. Come to the mic.
Yeah,
this has been a really good evening. But as I was saying backstage, it says, never forget, our people were always free. I'm thinking about this for the book, that even if we weren't free physically, we were free in our minds to effectuate freedom.
Yeah, that was the onion that I was unraveling in this book. I want to hear a question, and then I'll tell you about the onion.
It's partly a comment and a question.
Yeah.
I'm a teacher in Anne Arundel County.
Thank you.
Actually, I'm a school librarian, so no book bans.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Make sure the book's in there.
I'm a proud resident of Montgomery County, which has a very progressive, I don't know if you've read it, a climate action plan.
Mm-hmm.
And a dear friend of mine was one of the co-authors of that. And the one thing that he realized 2 years into that action plan was that the poor people had not been consulted in making this action plan.
Yes.
So now they have created a Climate Action Justice Academy. So maybe the Sierra Club can reach out to Montgomery County. It might be a
I
start,
suspect that our
because
folks are involved. They're pretty active.
Yeah, they're not right now, but I know that they're not. But I really am happy you're taking this next step because it's truly the logical step for you in terms of what you've done in your work. So,
And your question.
my question is, please reach out and have the Sierra Club create these communities because poor people are the ones who are suffering the most with climate action.
Exactly
we know
right.
that. We know it in large ways, but we also don't realize it in very small ways.
Yeah.
So anyway.
No, thank you.
Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, we did a report.
And thanks for Westmore.
Oh, yeah, he's great. I love Wes, I mean, dearly. You know, when I was at the NAACP, we did a report just on that. We took the UN Social Vulnerability Index and we overlaid it with the parts of the country most vulnerable to climate change, and it was like a hand in a glove. It really, and that includes poverty, includes poor white communities too. But the onion of the book, the title, Never Forget Our People. Just imagine yourself, black kid growing up, grandma, 3 out of 4 her grandparents were in slavery. Granddad, all of his great-grandparents were enslaved. And your grandma keeps whenever you try to ask a sensitive question, is like, we'll never forget our people were always free. It just made my brain hurt. And then I got, whatever, and that's far enough into puberty, I thought I'd confront my grandma. And I was like, what are you talking about? 3 of your grandparents were born into slavery. One of them, your own sister says, was a rapist. Who was free, Grandma? The rapist? And she just gave me this look, like she just pitied me. It was as if an atheist had challenged a nun and said, Mary couldn't be a virgin. What else you got, right? Like it was like one of those types of moments where it's like, you just don't mess with my faith, right?
That was a rough example, though.
It was a rough example, but this was a rough moment. This was a rough moment. I've seen an atheist try to do that once. It's not pretty. Yes, Sister Rosa in Washington Heights when we were organizing together. And so I took a step back and I said, Grandma, where'd you get this from? Well, my mom used to say it. My grandma used to say it. My great-grandma used to say it. Well, Grandma and great-grandma were both enslaved. So I started peeling back. And at first I was like, never forget our people were always free. Well, my grandma is cousins to Thomas Jefferson. She descends from his grandma. Maybe this is her summation of the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. Maybe this is, all men are endowed with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was said in the context of a monarchy and feudalism. So maybe this is that. No. Dig. We figured out where her maternal line began. And this was echoing down the maternal line. And when we figured that out, we figured out what this meant, and it blew my mind. It took a lot to get that far back into history to find the very first enslaved person on her maternal line. But when we figured that out, who that woman was, the rather unique circumstances of her enslavement, how it started, it made all the sense in the world. And it was like the biggest gift. My grandmother said that, her mother said that, her grandmother said that, my sister, my mom. I'm convinced not because it made sense to them, but because of how it made them feel, the way it made them stand up straight. But in the beginning, it was a call to insurrection. And even when they forgot the woman who first said it, and even when they forgot where she was from and what her story was, they kept repeating it because it gave them the strength to push against Jim Crow, to push against slavery.
It's so interesting that you say this, and then we're going to go to our next question. But it's so interesting you talk about the lineage. I have been really trying to find mine. I've been on Ancestry.com. I did, 23andMe, yeah.
Yes.
I was 23, yes, 23andMe. And I'm going on African Ancestry. So I know where, and it's so interesting when you're on these things, you see cousins from Texas that don't look like you. I'm like, how? Your fifth cousin, and I want, right.
Yeah.
I'm not Dick Cheney's relative yet, but
It's an elite club.
Anyway, Ben Jones, you don't want to know who my family members are. You know. Anyway, yes, ma'am. Next question.
Thank you so much.
He's got jokes. Okay?
I always got jokes. She knows that.
Thank you. I'm an attorney with ALDEF,
Okay.
Asian
thank
American
you.
Legal Defense and Education Fund. It's in New York City, and Asian Americans in New York City have the highest rates of poverty. Mm-hmm. They're also facing a lot of anti-Asian violence.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And we're struggling because we're trying to figure out, on one hand, we see the value of things like Matthew Shepard, James Byrd's Hate Crimes Act, right? Mm-hmm. It recognizes hate crimes against a community, like an assault against one person in that community is an assault against the whole community. It's recognizing a hate crime. These, we're thinking, are hate crimes. One elderly Asian person is pushed down, and a whole community of elderly Asians are staying in their house, afraid to come out to get their food because they're all afraid they're going to be pushed down. Who's pushing them? And there's a big concern, that it's other poor people in the city. I mean, the things that I see on videos are like, commuter suburban whites that are coming in and doing these horrible acts, but that's not all of it. A lot of it is people with mental illnesses, and a lot of it are brown and black brothers. And this is a problem of, we're really struggling with the over-prosecution, the over-criminalization, the over-incarceration of people. And we're really struggling with how do we respond to this. We don't want more policing. We want more support in the community, in the infrastructure. You
want it to stop, but you don't want to over-police.
Yeah. And we're just trying to figure this out, and I want to get, what are your thoughts on this?
And that's, the policing issue is happening now because you don't want more policing because it could lead to other things, correct?
Right.
Yeah. So, and the George Floyd justice and policing issue right now, it doesn't look like it's going to pass again because Tim Scott and Cory Booker, it's in the Senate, and they can't meet on the accountability of police. So we have to wait and see. But as someone who's a rights person, who has dealt with accountability, who's dealt with communities being brutalized and stereotyped and just thrown away, how do you answer her for this? Because this is very real in this moment. Asian hate is very, very real.
Well, it is real. And what I would say is I think the best hope for it, and I saw my parents do this in Monterey County, California, is to start where we should have been all along, which is getting all the community leaders to the table, like the whole rainbow of folks to the table, and admitting that we share a common problem and figuring it out. After 9/11, I was leading hearings on racial profiling across the country. There were some Asian American communities where they didn't want to testify because they basically didn't want the association. I was told that. I had Vietnamese American leaders say to me just straight up, we'll deal with the cops ourselves. There's no profit in us in being there with blacks and Latinos and poor white folks and anybody else. And so, and that shocked me in a way because I had grown up in a community where the OCA had been active for a long time, basically came out of the struggle of Chinese railroad workers. Yeah. The JACL had been active for a long time. It came out...
Organization of Chinese Americans and Japanese American Citizens League.
The Japanese American Citizens League predated internment, but obviously came out with a certain militancy. And in Monterey County, because the anti-Asian hate is something that's kind of always there, just like racism against blacks is always there. There's nothing new. It flares up and it goes down. But truly, when there was attack against one community, all those leaders acted like it was an attack against their community. I remember working with CAVA in New York City in the 90s, the Center Against Anti-Asian Violence, something like that, Coalition Against Anti-Asian Violence. And it felt like it was, again, it felt like there was a lot of bridge building that had to be done in the moment. And here we are 30 years later, and it's a crisis again. And I think, part of the solution has to be admitting, we're going to find a way to make progress, and yet this isn't going to completely go away. And the coalition of people that we feel like we need having our back now, we got to start organizing that right now, because we're going to need them 10 years from now, and it'll be different. What I would also say is that the history of cooperation and solidarity between the Black and Asian American community, going back to Frederick Douglass's opposition to the Chinese Exclusion Act, and is not a story that's really told in either communities, and that story needs to be told. And again, in California, split childhood between Northern California and West Baltimore. California, they told and retold those stories, and they rededicated to that solidarity, and it made a difference because people weren't as isolated, and they were able. The last thing I'd say is, it pains me, the situation with the police in this country that we're dealing with is a crisis of authoritarianism. We have been recruiting authoritarians to be police. We've got to change that. If that wasn't an issue, you would have more options right now, and we need to deal with that.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much.
And we thank all of you for your time. This has been a wonderful session. A wonderful session.
It's been fun.
It's been fun. You took us down history's lane.
Yeah.
Your family, kinships. I can't wait to hear about your picnic, your family picnic with the Cheneys. But and all of you go together and just have a good time. I would love to be a fly on that wall. So anyway, I want to thank you, Ben Jealous,
thank
for this
you.
amazing book. Never forget our people were always free. The book title again, Never Forget Our People Were Always Free. It takes you down the lane of history in so many ways, and also it takes us into your life. An activist, I guess you will. He is politician, activist, author, now the new head of the Sierra Club. We thank you. And all of you, please get this book. Please get this book. And don't forget, Black history is so important, and you are walking, living Black history.
Oh, thank you, sister.
History, period, but Black history.
As are you.
Well,
As
thank
are
you.
And I got to tell you guys, April Ryan is an institution in our country. When we were fighting the Biden administration to get them just to move faster, more aggressively on voting rights, there was only one reporter we could count on to keep standing up and asking the obvious question, and that was April Ryan. And I'm just grateful for you for what you do.
Well, thank you, my friend.